the future. JFK loved the poetry of somebody in this talk called John Boyle O'Reilly. And he has stated, "It is well to love liberty, for it demands much of those who would live by it. No one in the darkest cell, the remotest prison, under the most unyielding tyranny, is ever entirely lost in bondage while they are yet free men in the world." Now, I don't know about you, I watch a lot of movies, and you might watch movies like The Great Escape or The Escape from Alcatraz, but they pale into significance because I'm going to talk to you about the Catalpa rescue. One of the greatest escapes, not just in Irish history, but in the world. And a few days ago I was in New Bedford, and it was an incredible response to this. So let me do all the work. You relax, okay? It's going to be an hour, treat it like a movie, okay? But we're going to learn about how we snatched Irish Fenians from the belly of the British Empire. And the mastermind of that bold mission is the person in the center of that picture, John Devoy. The photo behind me is of the photo you see here is of the actual Catalpa ship, which was used in the audacious rescue of 6 Irish Fenians from one of the highest security prisons in the British colonies. This escape took years of planning and months of execution. This is the greatest propaganda coup in Fenian history, and most Irish people don't even know about it, but you will. 150 years ago, this happened. On this year, this is the date, 150 years ago, this is the year 150 years ago that this prison escape happened. In 1875, a Protestant American captain with no Irish ties set sail from New Bedford, Massachusetts, on what his crew believed was a routine whaling expedition. Unbeknownst to them, they were part of a high-stakes mission that relied on absolute secrecy for success. So, like I say, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Feel free to take as many pictures as you like. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this talk into 3 parts. And the first part is the voice from the tomb. In 1871, John Devoy's New York office receives a letter which would prove to be life-changing. It came from an imprisoned Fenian soldier. Some of you have the cards in your chair, okay? Martin Hogan, all the way from Australia. He begged for help. John Devoy did not answer him because he could not at this point offer assistance, but a second letter comes along, and that's the card that you see on your seat. This second letter is from an imprisoned Fenian soldier, James Wilson. This is the seed which sprung the Catalpa rescue. Dear friend, remember, this is a voice from the tomb. In this living tomb, the canker care of worm enters. That we have been nearly 9 years in this living tomb. It is impossible for mind or body to withstand the continual strain. I now, in the name of my comrades and myself, ask you to aid us. We think if you forsake us, we are friendless indeed. Now, as John Boyle O'Reilly said at the beginning of this talk, no one in the darkest cell is completely lost if there is a free man. And that's what we're going to learn about. That free man was John Devoy. Now, before I tell you about the 1875 Catalpa rescue, I have to give a backstory to it, okay? So 8 years before 1875, in 1865, okay, 10 years, John Devoy was appointed chief organizer of the Fenians in the British Army. So they would subvert the British Army, because the British Army are a trained force. They're not even going to know that we are converting them to the Irish cause, okay? And how he did that was through the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Now, as I say before, The Irish Republican Brotherhood is not the B team of the Irish Republican Army, okay? It's the opposite nearly, okay? They will subvert an organization. They will take control of an organization. They're crucial, and a lot of people didn't even know they existed, okay? John Devoy's duty was to enlist Irish soldiers from the British Army into the IRB. Now, where does he do this? He does this in number 1, Clare Lane in Dublin. This is Peter Curran's public house, okay? It's now a pharmacy. And I called in once to let them know, did you know this place used to recruit people into the Irish cause in 1867? They said, no, this is a pharmacy, we've no idea about that. Please leave the establishment. But it was, and it's the location where John Devoy met and swore in Irish soldiers from the British Army into the Fenians in an upstairs room. It is just beside the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin. Okay? Now, just to give you context in terms of the times in the 1860s, okay? Fenian John O'Leary has stated that 200,000 disbanded Irish soldiers since the American Civil War are gasping to be at the throat of England. Because remember, the American Civil War was coming to an end at this point, and a lot of them were Irish, and a lot of them are trained. Okay, so they're quite useful to this cause. John Devoy was very successful at infiltrating the British Army. By 1865, there were 26,000 regular troops in the British Army, but 8,000 John Devoy had sworn in to the IRB. So nearly a third have gone into the IRB. That's incredible in Ireland. That would have been such a big, massive campaign that they're going to have. It would dwarf 1916. Also involved in planning a rising is one of Boston Irish's famous sons, John Boyle O'Reilly. He was a daring Fenian, but he was within the British Army. But again, he was a Fenian, okay? And he had recruited 80 fellow British Hussars and secured the keys to a hidden gate. He was poised to lead a cavalry charge for Irish freedom. But what happened was they all waited too long. They delayed too long. Hesitation, and what's the most common thing that happens in Irish history? Betrayal happens, okay? Betrayal shatters the plan. And what could have been a bold uprising faded into another lost opportunity. Another thing that often happens in Ireland is the split, okay? And what happens is in America at this period, in Philadelphia, infighting begins, okay? In Philadelphia, the Fenian Brotherhood split. In the blue uniform, you see John O'Mahony there. And he wanted to send aid to Ireland. But William R. Roberts, who you see there as well, he wanted to invade Canada. Now, the idea of invading Canada was to use Canada as a bargaining chip because you're going to hold basically the British Empire to ransom, okay, by taking over Canada at that time to hopefully get Irish freedom. But they were divided in terms of tactics. The rivalry shattered the movement's momentum. It sabotaged the chance to infiltrate the British Army and turned a moment of opportunity into another missed strike for Irish independence. But, as I say, the Irish infiltrators waited too long. British informers exposed the Fenian infiltration. They forced the army to redeploy. They compromised regiments, were sent overseas. Okay, so they knew that there was Irish there, but let's send them to India. Let's send them somewhere else where they can't do any damage, okay, to the British Empire in Ireland. So they neutralized the potential impact that was going to happen. So everything's going wrong. The rebellion is crippled before it even begun. And what's worse is John Devoy is arrested and he's sentenced to 15 years. On February 22nd, 1866, John Devoy is arrested in Pillsworth Public House, okay, after Patrick Foley of the 5th Dragoons infiltrated the Fenians, triggering mass arrests and crushing the rebellion before it could even begin. Now, this is John Boyle O'Reilly, okay, and you see two pictures, one before incarceration and one after incarceration. And John Boyle O'Reilly was spared from the noose due to his youth, and he was instead condemned to the desolation of Western Australia. Like, that's hell for them. That's the other side of the world, okay? And it'll take months to get there by ship. It was a fate seen as nearly as cruel as death. Yet, from this wilderness, he's going to rise, not as a broken prisoner, but as one of the most powerful Irish voices in America. And now I'm going to introduce you to the Catalpa Six. And who are the Catalpa Six? Okay. I'm going to surprise you with who some of these people are, because Irish history is not black and white. Thomas Dara from Wicklow was a decorated British soldier, but he was a secret member of the IRB. He was also a former Orange man. Okay? He served the British Crown in China and Africa. He was a crack troop. He secretly embraced the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He recruited British troops into the Fenian cause. He was arrested for mutiny in 1865, and he is sentenced to death, later reduced to life imprisonment, unknowingly setting him on the path to the legendary Catalpa rescue. Thomas Hassett, okay, so Thomas Hassett is next, and that's Thomas Hassett there. And Thomas Hassett was a battle-hardened soldier from Cork. He had sworn hundreds into the IRB and plotted to seize Dublin's defences before betrayal seized his doom. Now what's interesting is, if you look at the bottom left of that picture there, okay, that's the tail end of Dublin where the red and white chimneys are, and it used to be a British weapons facility, and his idea was he was going to attack there, and what that was going to do was it's going to draw out the British troops to attack him, and then the Fenians could move into Dublin City. It was a very, very clever plan that was going to be in operation. But again, like I say, he was found out, he was arrested, court-martialed, and it was a death sentence that was reduced to life. Michael Harrington was another battle-hardened veteran. He was a British soldier, but he was also Irish Republican Brotherhood. He served in the 61st Regiment in Calcutta, India. He deserts the British Army in 1866 to join the Fenian Rising, only to be captured and condemned to death. His sentence is reduced to life in penal servitude. Robert Cranston is next. And Robert Cranston is from County Tyrone, a soldier of the 61st British Regiment. He was an informer in terms of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but they informed on him, the British. He was court-martialed, sentenced to death, later reduced to life in penal servitude. And as I mentioned before, James Wilson, the voice from the tomb, he was born in County Down, about 20 minutes away from me. He was a battle-tested British artilleryman who fought in the Bombay and 5th Dragoon Guards before turning Fenian. Okay? He deserts in 1865 to fight for Irish freedom, but was captured and sentenced to death. This is James Wilson and Martin Hogan, both in before and after photos, in terms of being arrested. So you can see how harsh prison conditions were on these men. And also, in terms of this story, you must understand that these men were doing this idea of them being British soldiers. This is like 60 years before Michael Collins was, infiltrating the British government with spies and informers that way, okay? This is among 15,000 others. These 6 Fenians abandoned their pensions, their careers and lives to fight for an Irish Republic. You can see arrested Fenians led to Dublin and Cork prisons here. Now, to break the Fenians, and this is where it gets horrific, okay? So I am warning you here. A Captain Whelan, an Irishman loyal to the British Crown, moved from prisoner to prisoner. He whispered that the man next to him had turned informer. They hadn't, but he was pretending. You're betrayed by him, okay? But he didn't inform you at all, okay? But they're trying to crack them. They're trying to crack the Irish Fenians, okay? He whispered that the man next door had turned informer and that civilian spies were flooding Dublin Castle. They weren't. The Fenians and John Boyle O'Reilly were branded as deserters. They had the letter D branded on their chest for deserters, okay? So everyone would know for the rest of their lives just what was taught of them. They were deported to hell. This is the Hougoumont ship. John Boyle O'Reilly and the 6 Catalpa prisoners mentioned were to be deported to Fremantle in southwestern Australia. Also on board were 320 criminal convicts and 63 Fenians. And interestingly enough, the picture that you see on the bottom right there with the guy with the moustache, that's Dennis Cashman. And in September of this year, the Fenian Memorial Committee had a headstone erected to him in Hollywood Cemetery in Boston. It now only happened there in September this year. This here is the Hougoumont. The picture on the right is cells in the lower deck of a convict ship. Okay. In October 1867, 63 shackled Fenians were sent aboard the Hougoumont ship. the last convict transport ship to the British colonies being Australia. Okay, so Australia is owned by Britain at this point. Okay, they were separated from common criminals, and it wasn't for the Fenians' safety, it was actually so the Fenians couldn't convince the criminals to join their cause and take over the ship. So they separated them. Okay, and they had to keep the Fenians active, otherwise the ship could have been taken over by the imprisoned Fenians. So what did they do? Well, they had to keep them occupied, so they gave them a newspaper to make on the ship. Okay, design your own newspaper, just stay active, just don't take over the ship, okay? How do you keep hope alive when chained and exiled across the world? That there is the newspaper that they created, the Wild Goose. Okay, that was created on board the ship, okay? Aboard the Hougoumont, the Fenians found unlikely allies among former comrades in the British Army and kept their spirits alive by creating the Wild Goose newspaper. And like I say, that is it. And if you ever hear of like the wild geese who fled in Irish folklore, it's based on that. It was a makeshift newspaper inspired by Ireland's legendary exiled warriors. So now we're going to enter the tomb. Welcome to the establishment. This is the tomb of Fremantle Prison in Australia, where these Fenians are sent. So what kind of prison offers no hope beyond its walls? This prison, Fremantle Prison, originally called the Convicts Establishment. It was a massive, fortress-like structure designed to house up to 1,000 convicts in cramped, windowless cells. Escape was a death sentence in itself. They actually didn't need walls, because if you escape to the sea, sharks. Escape to the bush, you'll die by sun. Okay, or else we even get starvation will happen. You've no chance of escape here, right? So starvation and brutal heat would reach 120 degrees, which would make survival impossible. And John Hampton, who you see there, Dr. John Hampton, took control, and his reputation for cruelty follows him from Van Diemen's Land, ensuring that life inside becomes just as unbearable as the wasteland beyond. And I'm going to tell you just how unbearable it became. Governor John Hampton's brutal rule over Fremantle Prison was marked by relentless flogging, solitary confinement, and shameless nepotism. He even employed his own unqualified son, who you see in that picture. I'm going to tell you how severe the floggings were. For 6 brutal years, Dr. John Hampton ruled Fremantle with merciless discipline, overseeing the flogging of 96 convicts who endured, remember, 96 convicts who endured a staggering 6,559 lashes in total. He revived the cat o' nine tails with vicious regularity. He reintroduced solitary confinement. He imposed brutal sentences. An escape attempt would mean 100 lashes and months of near starvation in isolation. In March 1867, he took his cruelty even further. He abolishes the Board of Visiting Magistrates. In other words, he ensures that the prisoners have no voice, no appeal, no hope of mercy. Prisoners were also kept in leg and body chains weighing over 40 pounds. That's an actual picture of the leg and body chains that the prisoners would have had. Prisoners would be kept in heavy iron manacles. Those restraints are taken from the Fremantle Prison Museum. Okay. How did the prisoners serve the Crown? Because they wanted to put them to work. The Fenians were more objectionable to both prison guards and townspeople than child murderers, rapists, okay? They didn't want them in the prison in the first place. The Fenians were despised by both guards and townspeople. They were forced into back-breaking labour. They cleared woods, they built roads, they constructed courthouses and lighthouses under brutal conditions. Punishments were severe, with death as a constant threat. They were despised by both guards and townspeople, as I say, and nature was your jailer. The establishment of Fremantle is a very secure prison because, as I said earlier, nature is your jailer. There's nowhere to go, all right? On one side is the vast Indian Ocean. It's teeming with sharks, and on the other, the endless Australian bush offered only starvation and death. And if you did escape, the British paid Aboriginal trackers to find them. There's no chance. Okay. So, where was this prison, the establishment? Because I know I'm talking about somewhere in Australia. I will bring this back to America in a minute. But where is this prison, the establishment? Fremantle is a busy port, as you can see here, and it's a thriving little town. It's a prison on a slope behind the town. It dominates the area. Okay, so I'll just show you the next 9 slides is Fremantle Prison around this period. So this is Fremantle town that you can see here. That's the town from high above up on the hill. Okay, it gives you an idea of Fremantle. That's the docks that eventually the Catalpa is going to come to. And again, you can see leading out into the sea. There's the centre of Fremantle town there. There's around the beach of Fremantle, and here is Fremantle Prison itself. Okay. Now, as I mentioned in New Bedford, I'm a teacher, by the way. I'm a school teacher, and I had some teachers that were going to Perth, Australia, at Fremantle Prison, and I was like, I'm going to America. Will you film it for me, please? Okay. So this is some videos that some of the teachers from Fremantle Prison visited. Okay, that I work with. Okay. So this is the prison cells inside. Okay. There is the outside of Fremantle Prison. And the picture in the middle, the video in the middle, that's the actual kind of cell that some of them would have had. Some of them wouldn't have even had windows. But you can see there's no bed, it's just a hammock. Okay. And these are really grim times to be a Fenian as well, okay? Because what happens is there's an assassination attempt on one of the royal family, one of the British royal family in Australia at this time, okay? A civilian called Henry James O'Farrell, who's there on the far side of that slide, okay? He was mentally unstable, and his 1868 assassination attempt on Prince Alfred's life was on a royal visit to Australia. And as you can imagine how the British would have reacted, that triggers mass anti-Irish hysteria and mass violence against Fenian prisoners in prison. Okay? It led to rushed draconian laws, public outrage, basic racism, and in swift execution. What the British did, they're panicking over this, and they transferred John Boyle O'Reilly to Bunbury. So I've got a map there you can see in the bottom left, just about how far roughly that would be from Fremantle to Bunbury Prison, okay? So John Boyle O'Reilly was in Fremantle jail, but the authorities decided to scatter the Fenians to weaken them, and O'Reilly was transferred to Bunbury, 166 kilometres south of Fremantle. And he is a courier. Okay, so they think he's like behaving well, and they let him deliver some letters. And something I left out of the last presentation was he actually got somebody pregnant who is one of the prison warder's daughters, actually. And yeah, but this is where things change drastically. So he gets beaten to a pulp by the British prison warden. And one day he's subject to very vindictive behaviour. He was accused of being late one time with a letter. And John Boyle O'Reilly was summoned to an office, and the warder held up a black bordered envelope. Now, for anybody who knows what a black bordered envelope is, it's called mourning stationery, okay? And that is a sign that there's a death in the family. It's nearly to pre-warn you there's a death in the family. And with deliberate malice, this prison warden informed John Boyle O'Reilly that because he was late, I'm not going to show you what's in the letter. And it would be months before John Boyle O'Reilly found out his mother had died. Also, for refusing to accept an anti-Irish insult in Fremantle Prison, Martin Hogan is sentenced to 6 months of solitary confinement. And he's shackled in chains in solitary confinement. Like, it's bad enough being in solitary confinement, but then to be shackled in chains in solitary confinement the entire time, and he survives on only bread and water. So, I don't know about you, but I know that sometimes, you let one or two people maybe take a shove, and then at one point you're like, I'm not going to take it anymore. I don't give a damn what's happening. I'm going to fight back. And that's what John Boyle O'Reilly did. John Boyle O'Reilly had made up his mind to escape. And who do you go to, especially if you're Irish, when you're in trouble? You go to a priest. And he met Cavan-born Father Patrick McCabe, who was visiting prisoners, and developed a friendship with John Boyle O'Reilly. And McCabe thought out a practical escape plan. Now, you must understand, the risk is immense, okay? Failure would risk in 100 strokes of the lash of the whip, which would lacerate the skin with each strike. Now, one of the Fenians described what these lacerations are like with a flogging, and I'm going to tell you. Floggings such as this were described by Fenian Thomas McCarthy Fennell as, with each lash, the laceration seems to change from blue to intense black. The flesh tears apart. 'Tis now red, and ghastly flow the purple fluid from the mangled pulp. After such a flogging, the convict then would have their backs rubbed with salt. John Boyle O'Reilly wants to defy the British Empire. You must understand the British Empire at this time are one of the biggest empires in the world. Okay? John Boyle O'Reilly's daring 1869 escape from Western Australia was aided by local allies, and he smuggled aboard a ship called the Gazelle. It was an 8-month odyssey of survival. Okay, it was really, really brave what he does. I'm not going to go in depth into his story because I'm going to focus on the Catalpa 6. But he's nearly captured, and through sheer resilience, he reaches Philadelphia. He's no longer an escaped convict. He's now a symbol of Irish defiance. Okay, his story would help inspire the legendary Catalpa rescue. Now, back in Ireland and in England, a growing amnesty movement is fueled by outrage over these brutal prison conditions Fenians are having, and it gains momentum. And there's a man there called O'Donovan Rossa, and he was elected while in prison as MP for Tipperary in 1869 while in prison. So basically, they're becoming a headache for the British even in prison. Okay, so the British are like, what are we going to do? Okay, this is just not going to work. Okay, we have to do something. So under mounting pressure, British Prime Minister William Gladstone, who you see there, grants a conditional pardon to the Fenians, but only if they lived in exile for the remainder of their sentences. In other words, go to America. Okay? But they don't release everybody. The Duke of Cambridge refused clemency for military Fenians. And it's not that I'm taking their side, I'm just trying to think, like, if you are the British Crown, if you let the military Fenians be released, what are you doing? You're encouraging your own soldiers to, rebel. So they have to try and set an example for the military Fenians, and they will not release them because they don't want to encourage spies and unrest in the British Army. So they're going to leave them to rot and die in prison. They had no hope of release or rescue. But in America, in 1871, this amnesty campaign secures the release of political Fenians like O'Donovan Rossa and John Devoy. They're nicknamed the Cuba Five. The reason that they're called the Cuba Five is because the ship is bringing them in is called the Cuba. They're hailed as heroes in America. While the military Fenians in Fremantle are imprisoned, they are sacrificed to Britain's fear of rebellion within their own ranks. Now the Cuba Five are met with a hero's welcome in New York, okay? Celebrated by the city's Irish community and even honoured in the US House of Representatives. This celebration will have a far-reaching effect for the Fremantle Six, still in prison. Miraculously, it reaches even the Fenian prisoners in Australia the news about what's happening in New York. Okay? So we're now going to look at how we're going to open up this tomb. So as I mentioned at the start, months after arriving in America, in the US, John Devoy receives a letter from Martin Hogan in Fremantle Prison. A desperate plea that reminds him freedom had not reached everyone, and military Fenians are still languishing in brutal captivity. John Devoy is now a journalist in America, and he's haunted, because again, remember, John Devoy recruited all these people, okay? And now John Devoy is like, and these people are in prison, and they're rotten, and it's my fault, okay? So he's haunted by the suffering of the Fenian soldiers left behind. And he says, he vows even, I felt that I, more than any man then living, ought to do my utmost for these Fenian soldiers. And though convincing Clan Gael to fund the rescue seems impossible, he sent word to Fremantle promising to try, okay, while the prisoners, starving and forgotten, clung to hope in their dark cells. Now, he does it, obviously, like, vaguely, like he sends it in like when a prisoner's going to basically say this to somebody else. It's not like he's writing a letter going, yeah, I'll free you, because the law, no, all right? So, but Thomas Hassett couldn't wait, okay, because this is taking forever. They don't know if they're going to be released or not. Thomas Hassett couldn't wait, and he makes a daring escape to Bunbury, Australia. But when the promised payment for passage never arrived, he was abandoned. He was captured as a stowaway, and he was sent back to Fremantle, where under heightened security, he was condemned to the brutal chain gang. So what happens when a man trapped in a living tomb refuses to be forgotten? Fenian James Wilson wrote to John Devoy with an escape plan, suggesting a ship disguised as a whaler and the use of horses to flee through the bush. And John Devoy doesn't reply, because he's hardly going to go, yeah, great idea, let's do that, you know. But he just doesn't reply. In desperation, Wilson is getting frustrated. He sends a second letter. And as I said at the start of this, that's now known as the voice from the tomb. Pleading, remember, this is the voice from the tomb. We've been nearly 9 years in this living tomb. If you forsake us, we are friendless indeed. With these haunting words of loyalty, he reminded Devoy they were still soldiers of liberty. A message that would finally stir the exiled Fenian John Devoy into action. Just on a side note, by the way, my mother is an English teacher, or she before she retired. But like, if you're ever looking for something like the power of the English language, like the pen is mightier than the sword, this letter is a perfect case of that. Now, incredibly, okay, so now we go to America, Baltimore in 1874. Mission Impossible begins. Okay, John Devoy's Mission Impossible begins at the Clan na Gael Convention in Baltimore in 1874. John Devoy had to convince the organisation not only that rescuing the Australian Fenian prisoners was possible, but also to grant permission for the Darien Plan. Now the risk is immense. Like, I mean, imagine if I said to all of you, we're going to rescue somebody in Australia, he's on first, right? Do you think one person would blab out of here? Probably, okay? But nobody did when John Devoy did it. The risk is immense. One informer or careless whisper could doom the entire operation. So how does he do it? Well, in a passionate plea, John Devoy read Martin Hogan's desperate letter aloud, and then he roars to the gathering, "These men are our brothers!" A cry that would set the wheels of the Catalpa rescue in motion. The convention miraculously votes unanimously in favour of the plans. A massive success for John Devoy. This report of the convention was then sent out to 86 branches across America. Up to 4,800 members learned a rescue was to take place, including the judge's relation, John McCullough, who was here earlier. So how do you fund an impossible rescue on the other side of the earth? Well, led by John Devoy, James Reynolds, John W. Goff, John C. Talbot Jr. and Patrick Mahon, the committee launched an appeal for funds to finance the daring mission, to win over cautious Clan na Gael members. They organised public functions, lectures, like this one, and entertainments, turning the cause into a movement no patriot could ignore. They also recruited a famous member of Irish history, John Mitchell. And John Mitchell had escaped Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania years before, and that had made him an icon. So they knew the propaganda value of if they were a success getting these guys out, this would be brilliant. But John Mitchell uses his influence at the Ireland Revisited lecture in New York to rally support. He donates his money to help fund the daring rescue of the Fenians still imprisoned in Australia. Now, the rescue committee relied on former Fremantle prisoners who had been released. Thomas McCarthy Fennell, who you see on the left, Dennis Cashman, John Boyle O'Reilly, who's now bearded that you see there in the picture, and John Keneally, whose first-hand knowledge of the prison's routines, guard movements and patrols became invaluable. Most crucially, O'Reilly's intimate understanding of the Bunbury coast would shape the daring Catalpa rescue, turning experience into strategy. So they knew the inner workings of this prison. So maybe these guys knew what they're talking about and they could help get these men out of prison. Now, one man who often gets overlooked, you probably haven't heard of him, but he's incredible, is James Reynolds. And he was a County Cavan native who built his success in New Haven, Connecticut. He poured his wealth into the Catalpa rescue. He became the ship's managing owner, and he also got the nickname Catalpa Jim. With Captain George Anthony's father-in-law, John T. Richardson, providing the final financial backing, the vessel was secured, ready to embark on one of the boldest prison breaks in the world. The Catalpa, and that's an illustration of it there, is a 202-ton cargo ship. It's purchased and refitted as a functioning whaler. So let's disguise this boat, okay? It was a cargo ship, we're going to make it look like a whaler. It was complete with a blubber deck, furnace, and harpoons to mask its true purpose, with costs soaring so high that a dedicated Clan na Gael member mortgaged his house to keep the mission alive. John Devoy convinces a man called George Anthony. Now, on Monday, when I was in New Bedford, I visited this man's grave. George Anthony was recommended by John Boyle O'Reilly. He was a newly married Yankee Protestant with no Irish ties, which makes this story even more incredible, that he doesn't have the Irish links. Anthony was swayed by John Devoy's passionate plea for Ireland's freedom. He had a lot of whaling experience, though he'd never captained a whaling ship before. He was also newly married with a kid. He later summed up his decision in 6 simple words to go on this mission. It was the right thing to do. So, Captain George Anthony was tasked not only with rescuing the Fenian prisoners, but also with filling the Catalpa with whale oil. And the reason that they wanted to have the boat with whale oil was to recover the mission's expenses. You see, in terms of like electricity, we needed like sperm whale oil, okay, to fund your lights. Okay, that was how we did things then. Okay, it's the time of Moby Dick. Okay, with only 9 months to pull off the daring escape, he set sail, keeping his crew completely unaware of the true purpose of their journey. And it's an incredible journey. This is the crew of the Catalpa when it departed. You may not be able to see at the back, but for those of you up the front, you may notice that there's very few Irish there that you see. That's the crew of the Catalpa. There's a Dennis Duggan there down on the bottom, but he's the only one who knows. Him and Captain Anthony at this point are the only ones who knows on this ship that this rescue is going to happen. Everybody else is just like sailors in it for the money. Okay. So only Dennis Duggan, who is from the Dublin branch of the Fenians. And John Devoy and Judge Goff see off the ship which left New Bedford 150 years ago. John Devoy and Judge Goff had to set about checking the bills and expenditure of the project. Now, I'm about to introduce you to my favourite person in Irish history, and you probably have not heard of him, and I think this man is a legend, okay? And this man is called John Breslin. So what kind of man can outwit an empire twice? This guy, John Breslin. He is known as the cool hand Luke of Irish history. He had already masterminded the 1865 escape of Fenian leader James Stephens from Richmond Prison. He had remained undetected as a hospital steward when he was breaking them out for a full year before slipping away to America. Now, with his intimate knowledge of the British prison system, he's the perfect man to orchestrate one of the most daring rescues the world had ever seen. And nearly half the money for this, okay, is raised in California. It was raised by Clonagale in California, giving them significant influence over the mission. As a result, they insisted that their chosen man, Tom Desmond, who you see here, accompanied John Breslin to Australia, ensuring their stake in the daring plan. On the 13th of September, John Breslin and Thomas Desmond leave for Australia. So you must understand, the Catalpa's already gone, but these men are going to go and they're going to actually arrive in Australia before the Catalpa arrive. Okay, they're like the front men, okay? They're going to build up the alibi for why they're down there. The Fenians in America assembled, it's basically like Ocean's 11 here, right? The Fenians in America assembled their own Ocean's 11 team. They send John Breslin and former San Francisco Sheriff's Deputy Tom Desmond as the advance men. So on September the 13th, 1875, they set sail from San Francisco aboard the Cyprian ship. That's the illustration of the Cyprian ship. They arrive in Australia a month later, but the Catalpa is still going to be months at sea, right? But what happens? You couldn't make this up. There's a second Fenian rescue in place to bust out these prisoners. So, upon arriving in Sydney, John Breslin and Tom Desmond learned from former Fremantle prisoner John Edward Kelly that another rescue attempt is already underway. An unexpected complication that could jeopardize their carefully laid plans. Like, if they go ahead with both prison escapes, that's going to muck up, both attempts to get the prisoners out. So, John Breslin brings them all on board, in terms of the one plan that we're going ahead with. And in November 1875, John Breslin settles into the Fremantle's Emerald Isle Hotel. Okay, so that's the actual picture of the hotel, okay? And he puts on a different name for himself. He calls himself James Collins. He pretends to be a wealthy prospector. He pretends to have lots and lots of money. While Thomas Desmond hid in plain sight as a carriage factory worker, secretly recruiting 5 Irishmen to cut the telegraph lines on the day of the escape. he deliberately leaves legal documents to be found. He's armed with forged legal documents claiming vast mining interests. So what does he do? John Breslin deliberately left them in plain sight in his Fremantle hotel room, knowing that gossiping maids would spread the story of a wealthy prospector, okay? Cementing his cover and keeping suspicion at bay. So he knew that the maids in the hotel were basically going to gossip about, oh, did you see the letter that I found on the floor? Okay, so. Also, he was having an affair, okay? All these Irish guys are very, very naughty, okay? While staying at the Emerald Isle Hotel in Fremantle, John Breslin had an affair with 22-year-old chambermaid Mary Tundut, who later became pregnant. And just as an aside, she gave birth in December 1876 to John Breslin's only child, though Breslin would never see her again after the escape happens, okay? But anyway, back to the story. So John Breslin is disguised as a wealthy investor. Okay? So he's pretending he's lots of money. Okay? He doesn't. John Breslin uses his wit to gain trust, securing the help of an Irish ex-prisoner who had access to the jail, and he could secretly deliver messages. So he knew one prisoner that could get messages to the jail. And he got one message to the jail, to the Catalpa 6, that said, "Destroy this for old Aaron, the door of the tomb is ajar." What does that mean? Okay, it means something is about to happen. Okay, that ignited their hope at least. Meantime, Captain Anthony and the Catalpa are still months away from Australia's shores because they're meant to be a whaling ship, okay, recouping their costs, going for whales. But as the Catalpa sailed south, Captain Anthony's crew still believed they were on a routine whaling voyage. But there's a lack of whales, okay, because basically this is like bumper whaling season, okay, so they couldn't find enough whales. The mounting costs and crew injuries made the deception harder to maintain. So what was Captain Anthony going to do? Was he going to stay at sea to recoup expenses, or was he going to execute the rescue at Fremantle? In the Azores, his crewmates just get fed up. There's no money, there's no ship, there's no whales, there's no money. And basically when he gets to the Azores, as well as dealing with a defective chronometer, Captain Anthony sets sail for Tenerife in the Canary Islands, but he loses a third of his crew. They desert him in the Azores. He knows that he could no longer hide the truth from his first mate, Samuel Smith. With a long and grueling journey ahead around the Cape of Good Hope and across the Indian Ocean, Smith had to be brought into the secret. If Samuel Smith refuses to take part in this daring rescue, Captain Anthony has no choice but to leave him behind in Tenerife. The mission's secrecy hangs on one man's decision. And after hearing what Captain Anthony had to say, Samuel Smith had a choice. Do I walk away in Tenerife, or do I stand beside Captain Anthony in one of the boldest rescues in history? His response was instant and unwavering. Captain Anthony, I'll stick by you in this ship if she goes to hell and burns off the bowsprit. On the 15th of March, the Catalpa is on the way, and you can see it's spotting St. Paul Islands. We're getting close to Australia there on that map. After months of monotonous travel and a few scares along the way, on the 15th of March 1876, the Catalpa spots St. Paul Island. The ship had been delayed significantly by bad weather. Now, we don't have email, we don't have internet, we don't have text messages, we can't say, I'm 3 months delayed, by the way, everybody relax. But people didn't know where they were this ship, okay? And John Devoy is under pressure. John Devoy is receiving frantic letters from Clan Miguel in Australia. They want news of the Catalpa. Where are they? Okay? But under immense pressure, John Devoy remains steady. He keeps his cool. He knows one rash move could unravel the entire mission. So the Catalpa arrives in Bunbury, about 100 kilometers south of Fremantle, Australia, on the 26th of March, 1876. Okay, so just pay attention to the month. 26th of March, 1876. Over the past few months, though, for John Breslin, the wealthy prospector, the stress is immense because he doesn't have any money, but he's pretending he's lots of money, right? So I need to, before I take the story any further, take you back 2 months so you can understand what John Breslin is doing in Fremantle and what he's up to while he's waiting for the Catalpa to arrive. So back to January, okay, for the past 3 months, John Breslin is still disguised as his persona, James Collins, the wealthy prospector. He's quietly moving through Fremantle. He's discovering that ex-Fenian William Foley had access to the prison. William Foley is released on a ticket of leave because he's got poor health. The prison is not as badly treating Fenian prisoners as it was a few years before, okay? But Foley became the vital link between John Breslin and James Wilson, the voice from the tomb, smuggling in the electrifying news that a rescue plan was unfolding. All the prisoners had been sent in from the various gangs in the bush and lodged in Fremantle prison. So John Breslin is going, perfect time for this rescue. But the Catalpa ship's not there yet, okay? All the prisoners were engaged in building a reservoir to supply water to shipping in the harbour. Perfect timing again for rescue. Catalpa ship's not arrived yet, okay? James Wilson, the voice from the tomb, was training a horse for the prison doctor. The employment gave him a chance at going out of the prison several times a day. Remember, there's no need for prison walls, okay? They had the sea or they had the bush, okay? He was able to keep in touch more easily with William Foley and John Breslin. Now, John Breslin moves in high society, okay? He carefully studied Fremantle Prison's layout and routines while revealing as little as possible about himself. He poses as a wealthy American investor. He charmed the town's residents with his good manners and engaging personality, making himself both popular and respected. His supposed fortune granted him access to Fremantle's high society. It allowed him to move freely and gather intelligence without suspicion. Now, incredibly, like I said, remember, this is not made up. This is all true, right? Eager to impress a wealthy American investor in Fremantle, what did they do? They actually brought him on a tour to the prison that he was about to get the prisoners out of. All right? So Fremantle's authorities unknowingly granted John Breslin a full tour of the prison he aims to infiltrate, exposing every critical detail from corridors to punishment cells. As I said, a cool hand look if ever there was one. Though he kept his composure, Breslin saw firsthand that escape from within is nearly impossible. His only chance lay in striking when the prisoners are outside of the walls of that prison. But is it too late? As weeks turn into months with no sign of the Catalpa, John Breslin's prolonged stay in Fremantle raises suspicion, forces him to travel between towns to maintain his cover, while the constant relocation of prisoners made communication fragile and the escape plan increasingly uncertain. Things are getting desperate. No word of the Catalpa. John Breslin relocates to Bunbury to buy time, under the guise of exploration, but he's no money either, right? While in Fremantle, John King, Fenian John King, is posing as a gold miner named Jones. He arrives at £384 from Clonmagale in New Zealand, quietly preparing for the escape. So there's a little bit of money to buy a little bit of time. Still don't know, though, is the boat coming or not. John Breslin is maintaining his disguise now under great difficulty. Suspicion is growing. John Breslin masks his true purpose by feigning interest in gold. He feigns or pretends to have an interest in wool. He pretends to have an interest in timber. But beneath his composed exterior, doubt is gnawing at him. Like, is the boat even going to arrive? And if it's not going to arrive, what am I going to do? Especially as a separate, uncoordinated rescue mission from Ireland threatened to derail Clonmagale's carefully laid plans. So, what else happens? A third planned escape for the Catalpa prisoners, took place, right? So again, John Breslin has to take these guys under his wing and go, no, you can't go ahead with this prison escape. You're going to balls up everything. We've been months in planning here. We've got a really, really good plan. You need to follow us. And he does that. Local Fremantle authorities arrogantly dismissed a warning by British intelligence about another two newly arrived Irishmen who were convinced that no one could escape Fremantle prison, though, so they kind of ignore it. But Breslin got those two Fenian people who were going to do the prison escape and put them to good use. He gets them to work for him. So I'm going to bring this together now. John Breslin and the Catalpa to meet up. Okay, so we're back to March now, right? After nearly 12 months at sea, Captain George Anthony finally reaches the rendezvous, March 29th, 1876. 3 months late, no clear contact, and knowing failure is not an option. He keeps most of the crew on board to prevent desertion. He steps into the small port, fully aware that the crisis at hand would be the true test of my courage. So John Breslin and Captain George Anthony meet. With the Catalpa finally in position, John Breslin met Captain Anthony in Bunbury to finalise the escape. Captain George Anthony, would sail for Rockingham, while Breslin alerted the prisoners at Fremantle Jetty. The plan was simple but perilous. The Catalpa would stay far out at sea. Okay? Now, when I say the Catalpa needs to stay far out at sea, 3 miles within Australia is seen as British waters. 3 miles outside of Australia is international waters. That's a very important point. The plan is simple but perilous. The Catalpa will stay far out at sea, while a whale boat will slip into Rockingham's deserted beach, where the prisoners would board and be rowed to freedom. With Royal Navy ships and customs officers disrupting the original escape on April the 6th, the plan is pushed to April the 17th. This is a perfect time to do the escape because they have the Perth Yacht Club regatta happening. So all the women will be in their fancy clothes, all the men will be in their fancy clothes. It'll basically be a big to-do, okay, amongst like high society in Australia. And all the police will be there with their uniforms and they'll all look great, okay? Now, before I continue with this story, this is an incredible story, and if this was a movie, you probably wouldn't hear about these two, but because this is reality, I'm going to tell you that not everybody escaped. James Keeley, once an intended escapee, was deliberately excluded from the Catalpa rescue because he wanted to betray his comrades in order to get a reduced sentence. And Thomas Delaney, that you see there, it was timing. He was confined. He was in solitary confinement at the time. So that left only 6 Fenians to seize their chance for freedom. Okay? But anyway, things are about to go nuts now, right? Monday morning, be ready. James Wilson labours at the jetty. John Breslin, in his suit and top hat, is just walking past, whispers in his ear, Monday morning, be ready. Right? James Wilson's even going, did I even hear that? Who is this guy? Okay? A message that sent the prisoners into silent readiness, knowing that if they weren't outside when the plan unfolded, they'd be left behind forever. Sunday night of Easter weekend, 1876, John Breslin's message to the prisoners echoes in the prisoners' minds. We have money, arms, and clothes. Let no man's heart fail him, for this chance may never come again. There was a sense that anything could go wrong at any time. Captain Anthony remarked, I could only trust Smith and the men in my own boat. So Samuel Smith and the men in his own boat are the only people he could trust. Anthony knew exactly where to land, as himself and Breslin had driven stakes into the beach, so they knew roughly where to land the boat, to mark the spot for escaping. Against John Devoy's original orders, Captain George Anthony left the Catalpa in the hands of First Mate Sam Smith, keeping it beyond the 3 mile limit. Captain Anthony's fate was now tied to the mission. He refused to remain on the sidelines. He's fully aware that he's gambling his life, his family, and career on what came next. And remember, he's no Irish ties. Do you know what I mean? He's like risking everything for this, right? According to Captain Anthony, we hauled up on the beach and I told the men to lie down and go to sleep. I walked the beach the whole night longing for the day. And now we're about to escape the tomb. At 5:30 a.m. on Easter Monday, John Breslin, Tom Desmond and their team set off towards Rockingham Road, armed with hats, coats and weapons for the escaping prisoners, because they'll need a disguise. Speed and secrecy were everything. One mistake, one wrong move, and the entire mission would unravel before their eyes. But where were the prisoners? At 8 a.m., Thomas Hassett and Robert Cranston got out of the prison compound unsupervised. Okay, so they just managed to sneak out. Some of the men were doing labour for the prison authorities. So like Thomas Dara was unsupervised outside the prison walls at this time. He happened to be digging potatoes for the people in the prison. James Harrington and Wilson were needed to move furniture in the warden's house. Martin Hogan at this time was painting the superintendent's house. He now painted a window like a symbol that he would now be seen, but they would not. he actually recounts saying, "Now I am the light." The escape begins. As Breslin watches the Fenian prisoners march towards him, they're there with their shovels and they're stepping out of Fremantle and into the daring escape. They nearly can't believe their eyes to see Breslin. And they throw their shovels into the ditch in defiance, where waiting horse traps and guns were there to aid their final break from captivity. Now, they're running for their lives with no time to waste. They leapt aboard the horse and traps, knowing they're now running for their lives. It's an intense 90-minute sprint by horse to Rockingham, where their fate hung in the balance. But something goes wrong. At the beach, the plan was beginning to unravel. A Rockingham local called James Bell had noticed the whaleboat and was suspicious about what they were doing there. He'd informed them that the SS Georgette was on patrol in the area. He also notices, as he hangs around, an arrival of the armed Fenians. The Fenians are arriving at the beach now, and this guy, this James Bell, is going, "What is going on here?" And Captain Anthony tries to reassure him that, don't worry, but Bell, he spots convict caps in the traps, and he goes, "Something is really, really up." A single witness, this James Bell, is threatening the perfect prison escape. A gun was actually going to be pulled on the local. And what would they do with him? Maybe they just need to shut him up. But Captain Anthony would not allow him to be shot. And it's a good job that you're going to find out that he didn't allow him to be shot. He said none of that will happen around here. But that local, that James Bell, he seizes the moment. He leaps on Fenian John King's abandoned horse. He bolts towards Fremantle, carrying the alarm that would unleash the authorities in pursuit. Until then, the police had been completely unaware of the escape. But now the hunt is on. Every second from now on is going to count. From now on, it's a race against time. An hour into the escape, the alarm is raised at the prison. Where had the prisoners escaped to? Bell told them that they had escaped in a whaleboat. The Fenians had launched the whaleboat. Okay, so a whaleboat is like a rowing boat, okay? But the police patrols were now in hot pursuit, and dispatches are now flying all over Fremantle. The chase is on. In front, freedom. Behind them, danger. Breslin reckoned it would take 4 to 5 hours of hard rowing to reach the Catalpa. When the whaleboat was 2 miles offshore, they saw the police on the beach at the spot on which they had embarked. The race, though, was not over yet, and now the enemy knows exactly where they are. Okay, so it's about to get really, really serious. Now the authorities know where they are. The element of surprise is now gone. The British sent after them 2 boats. The first was a Coast Guard cutter. The second, however, and you must understand the times that were then, was a steamship. Okay, so a steamship is far more powerful than a sail ship. Okay, powered by coal. Okay, the Australian governor commanded the fastest ship in Fremantle, the SS Georgette, a passenger steamer designed to bring the fugitives in. Now, John Breslin, a decade after masterminding James Stephen's escape from Richmond Prison, was now orchestrating an even bolder feat. He was liberating 6 Fenians from Fremantle's grip. But before vanishing into the storm, he left one final act of defiance. He leaves a letter to the British governor, mocking the rule by declaring, "I have released from the clemency of Her Most Gracious Majesty 6 Irishmen condemned for the unforgivable crime of love of country and hatred of tyranny." What a show, man. After 7 brutal hours of rowing, the 16 exhausted Fenians finally spot the Catalpa on the horizon, their lifeline to escape. But as hope surges, a storm begins. Okay? Thunder is roaring, lightning is splitting the sky, monstrous waves pound the waiting Catalpa ship, as if the very sea itself is conspiring to do what the British would not do. Captain George Anthony knows that the whaleboat was dangerously overloaded. The storm is relentless. Their chances of survival is dwindling. He kept his fears buried, shouting encouragement to keep the men rowing. With the Catalpa still distant, and the mast snapped, so the mast is now snapped on their little whaleboat, turning back means certain capture. Pressing forward meant a sliver of hope. Privately, Anthony isn't even sure they're going to last the night, but he's not going to tell the men that, okay? Because they're already, on their last legs. As towering waves crash over the whaleboat, the desperate crew bail water with anything they could. They used food tins, they used buckets, they used their bare hands, just keep the water out of the boat. While battling to reclaim their broken mast and soaked sail before the sea swallowed them whole. They're on their last, they're about to go under. They're exhausted, they're drenched, they're freezing. They knew one thing: if they couldn't keep the boat afloat, all hope of escape would be lost. And I think an incredible thing happens here, an incredible idea happens here. They get one of the oars and they use it as a makeshift mast to put it on, right? The mast is broken, the waves are threatening to sink them. The sailor improvises, he plants an oar upright to serve as a makeshift mast, securing a small jib sail to it. They harnessed whatever wind they could. They coaxed the battered boat forward despite the raging sea. The Catalpa spots the boat. At dawn, Samuel Smith spies that little battered whaleboat from the Catalpa. The rowboat with Breslin, Captain Anthony, and the Catalpa 6 is now on its way, but it's been followed. Bearing down with ferocious speed is the SS Georgette steamship. The hunter is now closing in on the hunted. The Georgette is surging forward under full steam. Major Charles Finnerty, who you see there, was determined to crush the escape, because what a humiliation for them that this happened under their watch. Captain Anthony knows the brutal truth. If the SS Georgette reaches the Catalpa first, the dream of freedom is over. It is done. And imagine what's going to happen to them as well if they get arrested. The prisoners, they put down their sail and they lay down in the tiny rowboat. Let's pretend we're not even in the boat, okay? The Georgette steams past half a mile from the small rowboat. Miraculously, it doesn't see them. Anthony thought she must have mistaken the whaleboat for a piece of floating timber. How lucky they were. But the Georgette actually reaches the Catalpa. The SS Georgette pulls alongside the Catalpa. Armed police demand to board and search the vessel. They're convinced they have the fugitives trapped. But First Mate Samuel Smith stood firm. He refuses the request. He knows that the Catalpa had already crossed beyond Britain's territorial 3-mile limit. You're in international waters. Back off, right? But James Wilson in the little whale ship, the voice in the tomb, he thinks he's done. He had the most awful time, this guy, the voice in the tomb. He's thinking suicide. James Wilson, the voice from the tomb, had endured years of torment. You can see it in his eyes in the picture. And as the Georgette closed in, he whispers the unthinkable: suicide. If rescue failed, they could not allow themselves to be taken alive. But the Georgette, the SS Georgette steamship, runs out of fuel. Right? The Georgette ran out of fuel and was forced to return to Fremantle as they'd been searching for the prisoners since early morning. They were running out of coal. But the British Coast Guard, the other boat, is closing in fast. Just as the Catalpa seemed in the clear, Captain Anthony's heart pounds. Another British vessel, the water police cutter, it's closing in fast. If it reaches them, every sacrifice would be in vain. This is the moment of truth. One more push. The Coast Guard cutter is closing in. The noose is tightening. The exhausted Fenians, they're drained, they're broken, but they're not yet beaten. They have one final chance to claim their freedom. Every aching muscle, every blistered hand, every ounce of will left in their bodies had to be poured into these last strokes. Stroke, stroke, row, you bastards! Row, row! This is it. The last fight of their lives. Failure is not an option. And they made it. Samuel Smith expertly maneuvers the Catalpa. He moves the Catalpa in between the British Coast Guard cutter and the whaleboat. He cuts off the British cutter just in time. He allows the exhausted men to scramble aboard. Only 400 yards from their pursuers. They were so close. As the furious crew of the cutter shouts in vain, the Catalpa turns towards the open sea. For the first time in a decade, the rescued Fenians knew the truth. They're free. John Breslin, ever the showman, decides I'm going to blow a kiss at the British, okay? As the water police cutter sat powerless in the waves, John Breslin blew a mocking kiss to the men who just lost their quarry. And only now did the British realise, hang on, that's that wealthy prospector that we knew. Why is he He's with the Fenians. He's in on it, okay? The so-called millionaire had outwitted the British crown, not once, but twice, leaving even the cutter's captain to nod in reluctant admiration before turning back to shore. It all looks good. It all looks great. This looks like a great story, but no. Captain Anthony steers the Catalpa away from the coast. Yet they still are not completely safe. During the night, the wind, it dies down now. Remember, it's a sailing ship, okay? They need the wind. The Catalpa is now becalmed. It's not moving. Oh my God, talk about timing, right? The SS Georgette, in the meantime, is now making its way back. Just before dawn, on April the 19th, the SS Georgette, and by the way, now they have a big gun, okay? There is now refueled and armed. They storm back into the chase as coal-powered engines are easily closing in on the Catalpa. The Catalpa is just a three-masted ship. John Breslin could see a company of British artillery on board the SS Georgette with a field-piece 12-pounder cannon trained on the Catalpa with their gunners at their posts. John Breslin says we may have to fight. As the Georgette looms over the Catalpa like a predator, John Breslin laid out the stark reality. Do you want to die now as free men, or die in prison? The answer was instant. I'll do whatever you say. And with that, Breslin made his stand. He gripped his revolver as the Fenians gathered in the cabin. They're going to be ready to fight to the last breath. Armed with nothing but whaling harpoons and Yankee defiance, the Catalpa's crew stands ready to see the British Navy not as an unstoppable force, but as a bully. And they've had enough of a bully. As a bully is trying to impose its will where it no longer belonged, the British fire a warning shot at the Catalpa. With a deck full of armed guards, the British Georgette fires a warning shot from its newly mounted 12-pounder cannon. A thunderous reminder that the British were prepared to use deadly force. The cannon goes directly over the Catalpa's bow. As the waves crashed around them from the cannon, the Georgette militia commander made his intentions clear. He's going to stop at nothing, even bloodshed, to drag these escaped Fenians back to their prison tomb. Samuel Smith on board the Catalpa is furious that his American flag had been fired on. He shouts, "Damn him! Let him sink us! We'll go down with the ship." Captain Anthony turns to John Breslin and asks him for advice. What should I do? Should we just give up now? We came so close. And without hesitation, and this is why I admire John Breslin so much, calm under fire, John Breslin says, "Hold on. Don't take any notice of the shot. Don't react." With those words, the Catalpa held its course. So in other words, you're making the British now play a second hand, right? Defiant, unwavering, they're daring the British Empire. Make your next move. Let's see what you're going to do. The Georgette and the Catalpa are now side by side. The British reloads their cannon. They demand the return of 6 convicts they could see standing on deck. But Captain Anthony, steady under pressure, gave nothing away. "There are no convicts here that I know of," he says. The Georgette's officers blustered about British law. The British said that they telegrammed the American government, and the might of the British Empire and the American government are behind them. The standoff is no longer about firepower, it's a battle of sheer will. But John Breslin thinks that they're bluffing. How does John Breslin think that they're bluffing? Why is John Breslin so sure that they haven't been in touch with the American government? I'll tell you why. Because John Breslin, remember I told you there was 3 prison escapes planned? John Breslin had arranged for those 2 Fenians to cut local telegraph lines across the south coast of Western Australia. So he's literally 10 steps ahead of the British. This was so it wouldn't alert nearby British warships. But what could Captain Anthony do? With the Georgette's cannon primed and British threats closing in, Captain Anthony faces the impossible. Do I surrender the men that I risked everything for? Do I surrender my life? Do I surrender, my future with my family? Or do I stand my ground against the might of an empire? His wife was waiting back in New Bedford with her child. His exhausted crew had been pushed to the brink, and the 6 Fenians had already stared death in the face too many times. Anthony had one final move left, his ace card. And with unshakable defiance, he played it. He raised your American flag. Captain Anthony, with a cannon aimed at his ship and the weight of 6 lives on his shoulders, made his final stand. He said, "This ship is sailing under the American flag. She's on the high seas. If you fire on her, you fire on the American flag." Declaration of war. He dared the British to risk an international crisis. With Britain still reeling from a £3 million loss to America from years before over a similar boundary dispute, the British knew, we can't do this. Anthony gambled that they wouldn't risk another costly diplomatic war, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted. And in that moment, you can also see, even today, all these people getting their citizenship earlier on, just how important your American flag is. The Catalpa was virtually defenseless. There's no cannons like the Catalpa have, there's no artillery. All they have is grit and the American flag. However, the SS Georgette are not done yet. They're quietly nudging the Catalpa back into British waters. But they don't know, the Catalpa crew don't know yet. Captain Anthony had gambled the British wouldn't dare fire on the American flag. He's right, but Georgette is bluffing. They're trying to nudge the Catalpa inside the 3-mile limit where British law could claim them. And what happens? The wind is suddenly dying, the Catalpa is stranded, they're unable to move forward, they're unable to escape, freedom is slipping away, all seems lost. But the wind rose. Just as all seemed lost, the wind rose like a blessing, filling the Catalpa's sails and sending the American flag billowing defiantly against the sky. The Catalpa aims for the SS Georgette. We're fed up with you. We're fed up of you bullying us, right? Captain Anthony seizes the moment. He swings the ship. He's going, I'm going straight for you, right? He swings the ship straight towards the Georgette, and he holds his course until the last possible moment before swerving, just barely clearing its rigging. The Catalpa is now heading home. With their bluff called, their power slipping away, the Georgette made one last desperate demand for the Catalpa to surrender, only to be met with silence. When they attempted to claim they could see Fenians on deck, Captain Anthony coolly dismisses them. No, there's no Fenians here, you're mistaken. In a final act of defiance, the British requested permission to board. Captain Anthony, he knows victory is sealed, he goes, no sir, I am bound for the sea, and cannot stop. As the Georgette fades into the distance, Anthony turned to his crew. They're laughing in triumph. I'm damn sure we won't be seeing them again. In New York, 4 months later, hundreds of thousands lined Broadway, cheering as the rescued Fenians were paraded through New York, their triumphant return dominating headlines worldwide and delivering a humiliating blow to the British Empire, proof that even the British mighty grip could be outwitted. However, the Catalpa 6 suffered from British prison brutality. John Devoy was shaken by the sight of the men he'd once known as spirited soldiers, now broken by a decade of British prison brutality. I'd known them as soldiers, he said, full of enthusiasm and spirit, and I was not prepared for the change which 10 years of the iron discipline of the British prison had wrought in some of them, he admitted. Though they had escaped Fremantle, the scars, mental, emotional, and physical, would never fully heal. So you can see pictures of them, both before and after pictures of their time in prison. The Fremantle Six remain in the United States for the rest of their lives. Now, interestingly, I was given a receipt by some Irish historians. That's the actual receipt of when the Catalpa the men were going to get their suits for the Welcome Home event. That's the actual receipt. It stands as a tangible link to the legendary Catalpa rescue. It documents the official reception of the Freeman